The cold arrived in Prospect's Gulch before the stagecoach did, creeping under collars and stealing the breath from men's lungs. It clung to the raw timber of the buildings and turned the mud of the main street into a treacherous lattice of frozen ruts. Leanne felt it through the thin floorboards of the coach, a deep chill that had little to do with the relentless Wyoming winter. It was the cold of uncertainty. For 3 months she had held a photograph of Mr. Alistair Finch, a man with a neat mustache and a gaze that promised stability. He was a merchant, his letter had stated, a man of standing who required a wife of good character and pleasant disposition. Her photograph, taken in a stuffy San Francisco studio, showed a poised young woman. It did not, however, have anything in the frame to indicate scale. When the coach door swung open, a wall of frigid air and curious eyes greeted her. She gathered the worn fabric of her light brown prairie dress and stepped down, first one booted foot, then the other, onto the hard, unforgiving ground. And then she rose to her full height. A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the small crowd gathered outside the general store. Leanne was tall. Not just for a woman from her homeland, but for a woman anywhere. She stood a head taller than most of the men on the street, and, most unfortunately, a good 4 inches taller than the meticulously dressed man now staring at her with undisguised horror. Mr. Finch's face, so composed in the photograph, had crumpled into a mask of disbelief and profound disappointment. He took a half step back, as if she were a sudden apparition. "You," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy against the wind. "You are Miss May Leanne?" "I am," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. Her English was careful, learned from missionaries and refined during her long journey. Finch's eyes darted from the top of her head down to her feet and back up again, a humiliating appraisal that made her feel like a piece of faulty livestock. He puffed out his chest, a pathetic attempt to reclaim some measure of physical dominance. "There has been a mistake, a grave misrepresentation." He addressed the onlookers now, his voice rising with indignation. "I sent for a bride, a delicate flower to grace my home." He gestured wildly toward Leanne, his face flushing a blotchy red. "I did not send for a timber pine. I paid for a wife, not a flagpole to hang my hat on." A few cruel chuckles broke the silence. Leanne stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her, her spine a rod of iron. She had faced hardship, poverty, and the vast, indifferent ocean to get here. She would not allow this small, vain man to break her. The hope that had sustained her for months dissolved into the frozen air, leaving only the biting cold and the sting of public shame. The laughter died as quickly as it had begun, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. The townsfolk of Prospect's Gulch were not inherently cruel, but they were wary of anything that deviated from the familiar. And Leanne, with her foreign features and startling height, was a deviation of the highest order. She felt their stares like a physical weight, 100 tiny judgments pressing down on her. Mr. Finch, emboldened by his audience, continued his tirade. "This is an insult to my station. To think I would be paired with this. It is unthinkable. She must be returned, sent back on the next coach." He spoke as if she were a misdelivered parcel, a piece of merchandise to be refused. Leanne kept her gaze fixed on a point just over his head, focusing on the weathered sign of the mercantile, his name painted in proud black letters. She would not look at him. She would not grant him the satisfaction of seeing her tears, though they burned behind her eyes. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Dignity was the only thing she had left, and she clung to it with ferocious strength. A woman with a stern face and iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun pushed her way through the onlookers. She was broad-shouldered and carried herself with an air of no-nonsense authority. "That's quite enough out of you, Alistair," the woman said, her voice a low rumble that cut through the tension. "The girl's half frozen, and you're squawking like a hen that's laid a square egg." She stopped in front of Leanne. Her eyes, though assessing, held a flicker of something that wasn't pity, but a grudging respect. "I'm Martha. I run the boarding house." She gave a curt nod. "The coach won't be back for a week, and I'll not see anyone freeze on the street, no matter how tall they stand. She'll stay with me." Finch sputtered. "Now, Martha, this is my affair. I won't be responsible for her board." Martha shot him a withering glare. "No one asked you to be. I am. It's settled." She placed a firm, calloused hand on Leanne's arm. The touch was not gentle, but it was solid. It was real. It was the first gesture of kindness she had received in this new, hostile world. Leanne allowed herself to be led away, walking past the silent crowd, her back straight, her head held high. She did not look back at the small man who had purchased her passage, only to discard her like a flawed commodity. At the very edge of the sparse crowd, leaning against the rough-hewn wall of the blacksmith shop, a man had watched the entire scene unfold. He was a monolith of a man, built on a scale that made the other townsfolk seem diminished. His shoulders were as broad as an axe handle was long, and even under his heavy winter coat of hide and wool, the dense muscle of his frame was apparent. Long, dark hair, unbound, fell past his shoulders, and a thick, untamed beard covered the lower half of his face, mingling with the fur collar of his coat. This was Rowan, a man who lived apart from the town, high in the snow-dusted peaks that loomed over the gulch. He came down only for supplies, his presence always a source of quiet speculation and unease for the townsfolk. He was a silent figure, moving with a ponderous grace that belied his immense size. He had not moved a muscle during Finch's outburst, his expression unreadable, his pale eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. He saw Finch's preening vanity, the crowd's skittish cruelty, and Martha's gruff decency. But mostly he saw the woman. He saw her step from the coach, her height a shock of grace and strength. He watched as Finch's venomous words struck her, and he saw the way she absorbed them, not with weakness, but with a stillness that was more powerful than any retort. She did not shrink or cower. She stood taller. While Finch and the others saw an unacceptable anomaly, an awkward giantess, Rowan saw something else. He saw a resilience that mirrored the ancient pines on his mountain, trees that bent in the fiercest storms but never broke. Her height was not a flaw. It was a statement. He watched as Martha led her away, his gaze following her until she disappeared inside the boarding house. He remained for a long time after the crowd dispersed, a silent guardian in the deepening twilight, the cold air swirling around him unnoticed. Martha's boarding house was warm and smelled of yeast and wood smoke. The room she gave Leanne was small and spare, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto a quiet alley, but it was immaculately clean. A heavy quilt was folded at the foot of the bed. "It's not much," Martha said, her tone still brisk, "but it's safe and it's warm." Leanne simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. Later, Martha brought her a bowl of thick venison stew and a hunk of fresh bread. She sat with Leanne while she ate, her silence more comforting than any platitude would have been. That evening, as the lamps were lit against the encroaching darkness, there was a heavy knock on the main door. Martha went to answer it and returned a moment later, followed by the giant from the street. Rowan filled the doorway, his presence seeming to shrink the entire room. He carried a large armload of split firewood, which he deposited neatly into the wood box by the hearth with surprising quietness. He then straightened up and looked toward Leanne. He pulled a small, smooth piece of slate and a nub of chalk from a pouch at his belt. He wrote on it, the chalk scratching softly in the quiet room, and showed it to Martha. She read it and nodded. "He wants to know if you're settled." Then she added, "This is Rowan, lives up on the mountain. He doesn't hear a word you say. Lost it in a mine blast years back." Rowan's eyes met Leanne's. There was no pity in his gaze, only a calm, steady regard. He wiped the slate clean with his thumb and wrote again, this time stepping closer and holding it out for Leanne to read. The letters were simple and blocky, but clear. "You are not what he said." 3 simple words. For the second time that day, a stranger's kindness pierced through her armor of composure. This time, a single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cold cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but not before he saw it. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and left as silently as he had arrived, leaving behind the gift of warmth and a message that rekindled a tiny, flickering ember of hope within her. Alistair Finch's pride, having been so publicly wounded, festered into a particularly nasty kind of malice. He could not abide the woman's continued presence in town. It was a towering, silent rebuke to his authority. He began to poison the well of public opinion, his whispers as insidious as the winter draft. In his mercantile, he would lean over the counter and speak in conspiratorial tones to his customers. "A woman that unnatural," he'd murmur. "She's bound to bring a curse with her. Mark my words." He insinuated that she had been dishonest, that she had deliberately concealed her affliction of height. He painted her as a cunning opportunist, not a wronged woman. The town, already unsettled by her strangeness, was fertile ground for his seeds of distrust. Soon, doors that might have opened to offer Leanne work were firmly shut. When she inquired about taking in laundry, she was told the work was already spoken for. When she offered her mending skills, she was met with cold refusals. Women would cross the street to avoid her, pulling their children close as if she were contagious. One local woman, Clara, whose own hopes had been pinned on catching Finch's eye, became his most vocal ally, adding her own shrill embellishments to the rumors. Leanne felt the ostracism like a physical barrier, an invisible wall that kept her isolated. Yet she maintained her routine. Every morning she helped Martha with chores, her movements efficient and graceful, her composure unwavering. She did not complain or rail against the injustice, but in the quiet moments, staring out her small window, the loneliness was a profound ache. Rowan's visits to town were infrequent, but he saw the shift. He saw the cold shoulders she received, the way Finch and his cronies would smirk as she passed. He said nothing, did nothing publicly, but his silent support continued. One morning, Martha found a freshly dressed rabbit and a small sack of potatoes on the back porch. Another day it was a bundle of fragrant herbs, and always there was a neatly stacked pile of firewood, far more than Martha could ever need. These were not gifts that demanded thanks, but quiet, practical statements of solidarity, offerings from the silent man on the mountain to the silent woman in the town. The first heavy snow of the season came without warning, a thick, smothering blanket of white that silenced the world. It fell for 2 days straight, piling in deep drifts against the buildings and transforming Prospect's Gulch into an isolated outpost. Inside the boarding house, the world had shrunk to the warm, fire-lit kitchen. To repay Martha's kindness and to keep her own hands busy, Leanne had begun to cook. Using a portion of the flour Rowan had left, she demonstrated a skill that mesmerized Martha. Her long, elegant fingers moved with a speed and precision that was hypnotic, pleating and folding small parcels of dough filled with spiced, minced rabbit. The dumplings were a taste of a world away, delicate and savory. As the blizzard raged outside, there was another heavy knock on the door. It was Rowan, a behemoth, caked in snow, his beard and hair laced with ice. He had come to check on them. Martha insisted he come in, and soon he was sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee warming his large hands. The warmth of the room slowly melted the ice from his beard, revealing the strong lines of his face. Leanne, feeling a need to communicate her gratitude, retrieved his slate from the mantelpiece where he'd left it on his last visit. She carefully wrote, "Thank you for the food. It is good." He read it, and a small, rare smile touched his lips, visible even through his thick beard. He took the slate and wrote back. A slow, quiet conversation began. He wrote of the silence on his mountain, how after the mine explosion the world had become a muffled, confusing roar. Up high the quiet was clean. It felt like peace. She, in turn, wrote of her home, not of the poverty that had driven her away, but of the smell of the sea and the taste of salt on the air. They passed the slate back and forth, sharing pieces of their pasts, two lonely souls finding a common language in the heart of a storm. After tasting one of her dumplings, he took the slate and wrote with a surprising delicacy, "Your hands are clever. They make beautiful things." Leanne felt a flush of warmth creep up her neck. It was the first compliment she had received that was not a veiled assessment of her suitability. It was a simple, honest observation, and it meant more to her than he could ever know. The weight of the snow was relentless. Sometime in the deep hours of the second night, a sound like a gunshot, but deeper and more resonant, cracked through the howl of the wind. A section of the boarding house roof over the back of the kitchen gave way with a groan of splintering timber. Snow and freezing air poured into the room, extinguishing a lantern and plunging part of the house into chaos. Martha and Leanne, shaken but unharmed, rushed to see a gaping hole in their sanctuary, the blizzard now inside with them. The next morning, what was left of the roof sagged dangerously, burdened by a mountain of fresh snow. News of the collapse spread through the town faster than the fire. For Alistair Finch, it was a gift, a divine validation of his prejudice. He gathered the mayor and other town council members in the street, a safe distance from the damaged building. "It's a sign," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with sanctimonious triumph. "I warned you all. That woman is a magnet for misfortune. The building is a public hazard. It must be condemned immediately for the safety of us all." His true motive was clear: to render Martha and Leanne homeless, to finally drive the tall woman from his sight. As Finch pontificated, a figure emerged from the swirling snow. It was Rowan. He had seen the damage from the edge of town. He strode past the cluster of officials without a glance, his focus entirely on the broken building. He walked the perimeter, his keen eyes assessing the fractured beams and the precarious load of snow. Then, without a word to anyone, he retrieved a sturdy shovel and a coil of rope from the blacksmith's and began to work. He moved with an economy of motion and a terrifying strength, securing a rope around his waist and scaling the treacherous, snow-covered roof. He was a solitary force against the storm's fury, a giant battling the very elements to protect the two women inside. Leanne, her heart lodged in her throat, watched from the kitchen doorway. She made a pot of hot, strong broth, and bundling herself against the biting wind, carried it out to him. He paused his work, his chest heaving, and took the cup from her, his gaze meeting hers over the rim. In his eyes she saw not heroism, but a simple, profound resolve. He was protecting his own. When the storm finally broke, the sun emerged, weak and watery, casting a brilliant, blinding glare across the snow-choked town. The citizens of Prospect's Gulch emerged from their homes, drawn by a morbid curiosity to the spectacle at Martha's boarding house. Alistair Finch was already there, holding court with the mayor. He pointed a gloved finger at the gaping hole, now covered by a makeshift but surprisingly sturdy-looking patch of canvas and salvaged timber. "You see, Mayor? A temporary fix. The entire structure is compromised. For the good of the town, you must sign the condemnation order." The mayor, a man more concerned with consensus than conviction, looked uneasy. Just as he was about to speak, Rowan climbed down from the roof. He was covered in a film of ice and sawdust, his face etched with fatigue, but he stood with an unshakable solidity. He walked directly toward the gathering of officials, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. He stopped before Finch, his shadow falling over the smaller man. He didn't need to hear the words. Finch's smug posture and pointing finger were language enough. Rowan pulled out his slate. The crowd fell silent, craning to see what the mountain man would write. In large, deliberate strokes, he wrote a message for all to see. Her only misfortune was meeting a small man. The words hung in the frigid air, a stark and brutal indictment. Finch's face went from ruddy to pale in an instant. The crowd murmured, the tide of opinion beginning to turn. People looked from Finch's sputtering indignation to Rowan's quiet, towering strength, and then to Leanne, who stood on the porch, her chin held high. Rowan wiped the slate clean and, turning to face her directly, wrote a new message, one intended only for her. My home is strong. It will not fall. It was a promise. It was an offer. It was everything. Martha, her arms crossed over her chest, stepped forward and fixed Finch with a look of pure contempt. Rowan has done more to protect this town in one storm than you have in 10 years of selling overpriced beans, Alistair. Now get off my property. The public shaming was a blow from which Alistair Finch's ego could not recover. The whispers and sidelong glances that had once been directed at Leanne now followed him down the street. The story of Rowan's written rebuke became town lore overnight, repeated with relish in the saloon and over fences. The moral compass of Prospect's Gulch, slow and reluctant, had finally swung away from him. His influence, built on a foundation of perceived prosperity and self-importance, crumbled. Within the week, he sold his mercantile to a traveling salesman for a fraction of its worth and boarded the eastbound stagecoach, his departure as unceremonious as Leanne's arrival had been. His absence left a vacuum that was quickly filled with a communal sense of shame, and then, slowly, with acceptance. The women of the town began to find their way to Martha's door, not with suspicion, but with offerings. One brought a length of blue calico, another a small tin of precious tea. They brought their mending and stayed to watch Leanne's clever hands at work, asking shyly if she might teach them how to fold the delicate dumplings. The blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, appeared one afternoon with 2 of his strongest sons, declaring they were there to help Rowan with a permanent repair to the roof. It was a town's quiet apology. One evening, as a lavender twilight settled over the snow, Rowan found Leanne sweeping the porch. The air was still and so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. He stood before her for a moment, his silent presence a comfort she had come to cherish. He took her hand, the one not holding the broom, his own rough and calloused, enveloping hers completely. With his other hand, he placed his slate into her palm. A message was already written there, the chalk stark against the dark surface. I do not have much, a cabin, a quiet life, but it is a good life. I would be honored to share it with you. Tears welled in Leanne's eyes, hot and immediate, blurring the precious words. This man who had seen her strength when others saw only a flaw was offering her a home, not just a roof, but a place to belong. She took the chalk from his fingers, her own hand trembling, and beneath his question she wrote a single, emphatic word. Yes. Their wedding was not held in the town's small church, but in Martha's newly repaired kitchen, which had become the heart of Leanne's new life. The room was crowded with the people who had once shunned her, their presence now a testament to the power of quiet dignity. The air was filled with the warm, comforting sense of baking bread and roasted meat. Leanne did not wear white, but a simple dress made from the blue calico a neighbor had gifted her, sewn with tiny, perfect stitches. Standing beside her, Rowan seemed to fill the entire room, not just with his size, but with a palpable aura of contentment. He had trimmed his formidable beard and tied back his long dark hair with a leather cord, revealing the handsome, strong line of his jaw. The mayor officiated, but the real vows were exchanged in silence. Rowan held his slate, upon which he had written his promise to her, a promise of shelter, of loyalty, of a shared hearth. He held it for her to read, his pale eyes searching hers. In response, Leanne took the slate and wrote her own vow beneath his, a promise of companionship, of care, of a shared life. They passed the slate to Martha, their silent witness, who wiped a tear from her eye with the back of her hand. Later, outside in the crisp winter air, Rowan lifted Leanne effortlessly onto the back of his sturdy mountain horse, swinging up behind her. He wrapped one strong arm around her waist, pulling her back against the solid warmth of his chest as they began their journey up the winding path into the mountains. His cabin was exactly as she had imagined, small, made of thick, dark logs, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. It was a fortress of solitude and peace. Inside, a fire was already blazing, casting a warm, dancing light over the simple room. That night, sitting on a bearskin rug before the hearth, he began to teach her his language. He touched the stone of the fireplace, then held up his hand, fingers together, thumb out, and moved it in a gentle flicker. "Fire," he mouthed, the word a silent breath. He drew her closer to the heat, rubbing his hands together, then signed, "Warm." He looked around the small, safe room, then brought his hands together to form a roof. "Home." She watched, her mind sharp, her heart open, and mirrored his gestures. Finally, he took her hand and placed it over his heart. He tapped his own chest, then tapped hers, then linked their index fingers together. You, me, together. In the profound, snow-dampened silence of the high mountains, where the world was stripped down to the pines, the stars, and the warmth of the fire, Leanne finally understood. She had traveled across the world seeking a voice to tell her she belonged, only to find it in the quietest man she had ever met.